Okay, I just want to get bear with me one more moment, everybody. I know you're waiting and you're in various places all over the planet. The whole thing is amazing, but so that I don't lose my bearings, I have to adjust my screen a certain way. Okay. So I'm hoping that you're all seeing a screen that says Bruchim Habayim, the Barbados Jewish community welcomes you. And we do, really appreciative to my Jewish learning for this opportunity to share the history of Barbados. It's a really fascinating story here. As Mara mentioned, I'm from the US. I've been in Barbados for almost 7 years. When I arrived here, I'll tell you how I came to Barbados. I did a Google search for Caribbean islands that had a synagogue and a bridge club. So Rabbi Google suggested that I try Barbados. That's how I came to Barbados. And so I arrived here. I was saying Kaddish for my wife. I just needed a synagogue. I did not realize when I arrived here that it was this synagogue. This is a really fascinating community. And I really appreciate the opportunity to share this information with you. There will be a Q&A at the end. And I've asked Mara and anyone else, if I lose you at any point, please feel free to jump in. I'm a tour guide at the synagogue downtown. Actually, after I finish this virtual tour, I'm physically headed downtown to do a tour. And we put together this virtual tour when COVID happened, because all the in-person tours that happened as a result of cruise ship passengers, that all disappeared, as you know, during COVID. So I'm going to begin our tour now. Let me see if I can. So this is primarily just going forward. So, you know, the primary orientation here is history. This is going to be a history tour for the most part. But in order to get it all properly oriented, you need to see where we are geographically. So this is a modern Google map of Barbados, of the Caribbean Sea. You can see Barbados is the easternmost of all the Caribbean islands. This is Florida, and this is South America. So because of its location, Barbados is not typically in the path of storms. There's not been a major storm hit in Barbados since 1955. This is a blow up. I wanted to show you the bigger area because we're going to be going into the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries when you had sailing ships that dominated the Atlantic basin. And you can see Barbados was on a strategic location. Any sailing ships that were coming from the colonial powers in Europe, if they were going to South America, Barbados is right on the way. And it's also a strategic staging point for anybody going from South America to North America. In the 17th century, the two largest British installations in the New World, the largest British cities in the New World, were Boston and Bridgetown. And Bridgetown was actually bigger than Boston for many years. So that's where we're located geographically. Zooming, I'm going to zoom in now. This is the modern. This is the island of Barbados. The commercial center is a city called Bridgetown, which is right here. This is where the old historic synagogue is located. You'll notice there appears to be one significant highway in the island, which is accurate. Everything else is a second-tier road. Just so that you have your orientation, Barbados is 166 square miles. The resident population here is about 270,000 citizens. During the winter, the population doubles with tourists. Barbados is a republic. It has a seat in the UN. It's a former Commonwealth nation. It had been a British colony, but it's now a republic. The Prime Minister here, Mia Amor Motley, is in the running to be the next Secretary General of the UN. She's likely to get the position. Very prominent woman, our Prime Minister here. So now, moving down a little further. Now we're getting, this is Bridgetown. We've zoomed into Bridgetown. This is downtown Bridgetown. This is the oldest part of the city, of the whole island. And you can see that the old Nidhe Israel Synagogue and Museum is right in this very old, actually the waterfront used to be along Broad Street here, where you see where my cursor is going now. This is where the waterfront used to be. So the synagogue was very close to the waterfront. Back in the 17th century, this was the bustling downtown. Take a look at Swan Street right here. So Swan Street doesn't look this way today, but in the 17th and 18th and 19th century, Swan Street was regularly referred to as Jew Street. Whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. I'm going to go back. Swan Street was regularly referred to as Jew Street. This was not a pejorative. It was not anti-Semitic. This is just where the Jews lived. So Jews were living above their retail shops. This looked a little bit like the Lower East Side back in the 19th century. Jews lived on Swan Street. They had retail shops and they lived above their shops, and they were close to the synagogue. So this area now is sort of a downscale commercial area. The Jewish community in Barbados is now down to 50 people, not families. I'm talking about 50 individuals. I am 2% of the population of Barbados. And the Jews live everywhere. There's no Jewish quarter. There's no specific Jewish area. I'll tell you later, I'll show you later, we actually have another small synagogue. This is like a little steeple in an area called Christchurch, which is further south than Bridgetown. But the Nidhe Israel Synagogue and Museum that you see here, this is where people come to tour the synagogue. There's, as you see, there's a museum, the restored synagogue. It's important to point out that this property is not owned by the Jewish community of Barbados. The synagogue and the museum are all part of the Barbados National Trust. So those of you from the UK will know that the National Trust is the organization that owns all of the historic properties in the country. So we have a tiny community here. If God forbid the community ever disappeared, the history, the legacy of the Sephardi community here and the synagogue building itself would all be preserved as a national museum. It actually is a national museum now. So today in our tiny community, we actually, like every other Jewish community, we have two organizations. We have an organization that manages this historic property, and then we have our conservative congregation. We do come together on Friday nights to pray at the for our Minhag is Friday night Kabbalat Shabbat service. We typically don't have a Saturday morning Kriya. We just don't have the resources, but we're pretty avid about keeping our Friday night service commitment. And during the winter months, when we have tourists here, the place fills up. During Hanukkah, we can have 100 to 150 people at the historic synagogue. We're just about to get there. So if you were visiting us here in Barbados and got off a cruise ship or an airplane and came down, you'd pay a gate fee. As I said, this is a museum, actually. I'm going to show you this short video. This is just as though you're entering the compound at the synagogue in Barbados. I know you're not feeling the open air. I apologize, this is sort of handheld, it's herky-jerky, but you get the flavor of it. Pay attention, I stopped it for a second, pay attention to this wall that surrounds the compound. I'm going to be addressing that wall later, I'll be talking about it. This is the mikveh, this is the museum building over here. There are cemeteries on three sides. I'm going to walk you into the synagogue structure and we're going to take a brief look at it. We'll come back to it later. This is not all you're going to see. I'm going to be showing other images, but just to get to familiarize you with our shul. This is what it looks like. This is a restoration from 1985, and I'll be telling you how that has come to be. Okay, so now we're going to get into the history tour. How did the synagogue come to be? How long has it been there? It's officially dated from 1654. There are there are circumstantial records, newspaper records, etc. The first definitive evidence that we have of the Jewish synagogue in Bridgetown is this map. This is an interesting historical document I'm showing you. This is famous in Barbados history. This is the Norwood map. This is the first surveyor's map of downtown Bridgetown. And the Jews synagogue, notice, follow the along the line here, the archaic spelling. This is the border of the Jews synagogue, this wall. So to keep it in perspective, this is not the same, this is not the original masonry, because this has gone over 395 years, but this is the original footprint of the Jewish quarter in Bridgetown. We're dating it from 1654, call it the middle of the century. So the Jewish quarter in Bridgetown, in order to know what that means, it's actually an interesting place. We have to do a quick survey of what it's like for Jews in other parts of the world in the 1650s. So if you're an Ashkenazi Jew like me and my ancestors, you're living in Eastern Europe in these rural areas in Poland and Russia that later will become the Pale of Settlement. But 17th century, the Pale of Settlement isn't actually declared until 1769. But Ashkenazi Jews are living a pretty miserable existence in Eastern Europe. In 1648, which is very close to this date, you have the Khmelnytsky uprising in the Ukraine. This is a group of Zaporizhia is in the news today. This is an area that's under attack in the Ukrainian war. But in 1648, the Zaporizhian Cossacks, this is a host of 1.5 million Cossacks, revolted against their Polish overlords. And in the process, they killed 100,000 Jews. This is called the Khmelnytsky massacre, and before the modern Nazi Holocaust, this was the defining cataclysmic event in modern Jewish history in the middle of the centuries there. Look it up, 1648, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, and it was anti-Semitic, but it was really a political rebellion. So the Jews in Eastern Europe don't have it good right now. Western Europe, there are some Jews who are living in cities in Western Europe, Venice and Amsterdam. So look at the Sephardi Jews. The Sephardic Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492. Most of them went into the Ottoman lands, but some went to Venice and Amsterdam and other cities that were hospitable to Jews. But in these Western European cities, Jews are living in ghettos. These are walled areas where they literally have to report back at night, and they're walled there at night. They can go out and conduct business during the day, but at night there are Christian guards that are paid by the Jews, and they watch over the walls to make sure that the Jews don't go out at night and commit their nefarious Jewish deeds, whatever they are. So living in a ghetto in Europe in the 17th century involves this lack of freedom. Here in Barbados, the Jewish quarter is actually not a ghetto. The Jews are free to move around. In the Jewish quarter here, only the rabbi and the chazan live. The rest of the community is free to move around, even at night. And this is a big deal in the 17th century. It's really hard to imagine the sense of freedom that the Jews in Barbados felt. They didn't have to be accounted for at night. They could actually go out at night. Imagine being a non-Jew and encountering a Jew at night in Barbados. How scary could that be? The freedom of the Jews in Barbados spreads like wildfire. Everybody is aware of this, and it becomes big news. They don't have an internet then, but the news travels as fast as it can. And this freedom for the Jews in Bridgetown is all the result of the personal intervention of Oliver Cromwell. This is the Protestant leader of England, who has allowed the Jews into Barbados and given them all this freedom. So that's the beginning. I'm setting up the history tour. That's the tour that we're going to take now. I'm going to talk about how the Jews came to Barbados under the protection of Oliver Cromwell. This is a timeline of Jewish history in Barbados. We're only going to deal now with the first few years, so I'm going to blow it up a little bit. And I'm going to leave this screen up for a few minutes, give you some historical background. It'll give you a chance to read more about what's been going on. And in a couple of minutes, I'll return to the images. But just in terms of getting your bearings, I found it helpful to leave this up for people to look at while I'm speaking. So 1627 is the beginning of history in Barbados, general history. The British arrived, there's no indigenous population. The first settlers here are British aristocrats, actually. These are the children of lords and dukes and earls that have lent money to King James or King Charles, and they've been repaid with land in the New World. This is not how they were expecting to be repaid. It's not how they wanted to be repaid, but that's how they got repaid. So they're making the most of it. So these English aristocrats are aristocrats. They know nothing about work at all. And the only way to make a living in the New World is with physical work. So the English aristocrats bring with them their Irish indentured servants by the thousand. So these are young Irish Catholics, boys and girls, that have been kidnapped. I'm not exaggerating. They've been kidnapped by Oliver Cromwell's Army of the Parliament, which has gone on several sweeps through Ireland. The army kidnaps these young Catholics, and they ship them to Barbados and to South Carolina to work in the cotton fields and in the sugar plantations. Oliver Cromwell, if there are people in our audience who have Irish descent, I guess I apologize in advance. To Irish people, Oliver Cromwell is a genocidal maniac. He thought of Catholics as barbarians. He treated them like slaves. After the Army of the Parliament was finished, the Parliament in England, the Protestant Parliament, issued a bounty on Catholics. And private bounty hunters went into Ireland, and they were paid £7 for a girl and £10 for a boy and £20 for a priest. And these people were kidnapped, shipped to Barbados, and that's how the English aristocrats powered their economic affairs in Barbados in 1627. This is before the age of African slaves. You don't have black slaves here. So now look at the timeline. We're going to go to 1654. This is when the Jews arrive in Barbados. Think about it. This is only 27 years after the British have arrived, so the island is not particularly well developed. But listen to how this happens. This is actually the story. This is documented in the newspapers. It's amazing. One morning in February 1654, these three big three-masted sailing ships, they pull out of the mist in Bridgetown Harbor, and they discharge 285 dark-coated Spanish-speaking Orthodox Jews. So these people are they land themselves in Barbados, and they're speaking Spanish and Portuguese. They're wearing their skull caps. The men have their payas. When they speak among themselves, they're talking Ladino, which is a language that nobody in Barbados has ever heard before. So just think about how this appears to the local population. These are the English aristocrats and their very superstitious Irish Catholic servants. If a spaceship had landed in Barbados in 1654 and little green people had gotten off, I'm not really sure the reaction would have been very different. The population in Barbados was astonished by the arrival of the Jews. Who were these people? What did they, I mean, they looked as strange as they could be. What did they want with Barbados? And the most amazing thing is, why won't they take off their coats in the middle of the tropics? These people are walking around with their coats on. The whole thing is very bizarre. So two big historical questions are raised as a result of the arrival of the Jews in Barbados in 1654. One is, Why are there 3 boatloads of Jews floating around the Atlantic? That's an interesting question. And the other question is, if there were such ships, why would they call on a British colony? Some of you may know, many of you may know, that Jews have been expelled from England in the year 1290. Jews are not allowed to live legally anywhere in the British domains. So, and everybody knows this. Jews certainly know this. So if you have a group of Jews, why would they call on a British colony? So the answer to the first question is, I'm going to go back to our images now, if I can get my cursor back. So this is how these people would have been dressed. This is an image that shows up in the Barbados Jewish Museum. So the answer is, why are there 3 ships of Jews floating around the Atlantic? The answer is, actually, there are 44 such ships, not just 3. These ships have been sent by the Dutch West India Company. This is a huge business. It's run out of Amsterdam. Think of Amazon.com. The Dutch East and West India Companies are these huge mercantile operations. They dominate world trade. And the Dutch West India Company has sent 44 ships, chartered ships, to Brazil to rescue the Jews of Brazil, who have been sent there by the Dutch West India Company to set up a trading post in a city that's now called Recife. This is the modern city of Recife in Brazil, eastern Brazil. Back then it was called New Holland. And it was the principal trading post of the Dutch West India Company. Starting in 1630, Jews, Spanish and Portuguese-speaking Jews who had been living in Amsterdam were invited to move to Brazil, where they were guaranteed religious liberty in writing. Unheard of in the 17th century. Jews don't have the legal right to live anywhere. So the Dutch West India Company guarantees their legal right to live in Brazil if they will just settle that town and engage in trade there. So by 1640, there are almost 2,500 Jews living in Recife, Brazil. They have 3 synagogues. They're engaged in the sugar business. They are trading precious dyes and woods, other products from the South American continent. And they're doing quite well. They constitute almost the entire population of the town of Recife. They have, as I said, they have 3 synagogues. There was a Sephardic synagogue, there was an Ashkenazi synagogue, and then there was a 3rd synagogue we don't know much about. We assume this is the synagogue that nobody would go to. So the Sephardic Jews are doing well in Brazil until 1654, which is when the Portuguese arrive and reconquer this part of Brazil. Think about Brazil today. They speak Portuguese in Brazil. They don't speak Dutch. There's a reason for this. So the Portuguese arrive, and they still have an active Inquisition. They're aligned with the Spaniards. So the Jews are not welcome. They're given 6 months to leave, and the Dutch West India Company sends 44 ships to rescue the Jews of Recife, Brazil. Most of these people go back to Amsterdam. 3 of these ships or more make their way to a city that was then called New Amsterdam. Those of you in North America will recognize this is now New York City. And this is the beginning of the the presence in colonial North America, the Jewish presence in colonial North America. The first Jews in New York were Jews who were fleeing the Portuguese Inquisition in Brazil. Today at 71st Street in Central Park West, you have the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue. These are descendants of the same group of Jews that I'm talking about that fled Brazil in 1654. The 3 ships that arrived in Barbados. So now the question is, why would ships stop in an English colony? The 3 ships that stopped here, the head of the expedition was a man named Abraham de Mercado. He was Portuguese, but he had in his possession a letter that was signed by Oliver Cromwell. This was a letter of safe passage. Back in the 17th century, when you're traveling by ship, when you're traveling by sailing ship, you don't have tickets. And just so you know, if you get on a sailing ship in the 17th century, your chances of getting where you're going if it's not wartime, are about 80%. So you have pirates, you have disease, you have storms, you have all kinds of things that can make getting on a sailing ship be a very unpredictable experience. During wartime, your chances of getting to your destination were sometimes less than 50%. So anybody that traveled on a sailing ship tried to have a letter of safe passage. This is the closest thing you can get to protection. And this group of 3 ships headed by Abraham de Mercado, they had a letter of safe passage that had been dictated personally by Oliver Cromwell. It was written in this very archaic legal English. I'm going to read it out in what it would have said in modern English. The letter says, this authorizes Abraham de Mercado and his Jewish compatriots to practice their Jewish faith in Barbados, and for Abraham to practice medicine. He was a physician. So now the big question becomes, why would Oliver Cromwell write such a letter? Oliver Cromwell has just overturned 360 some odd years of British policy. He's overturned the Edict of Expulsion by allowing the Jews into Barbados. What is going on here? So I can't spend any more time on it in this tour. I really encourage you to read about it. At least 6 books, 3 PhDs have been written about this. But the very briefest thumbnail sketch of the situation is, in 1654, Oliver Cromwell is already doing business with the Jewish bankers in Amsterdam. They're lending him money. They're financing his wars. They're paying his soldiers. Why are the Jews in Amsterdam supportive of Oliver Cromwell? Because he's fighting the Spaniards and the Portuguese that have the Inquisition against the Jews. This is a political thing. The Jews support Oliver Cromwell because they have a common enemy. Jews don't have an army. They don't know how to go fight the Portuguese and the Spanish, but Oliver Cromwell does. So they lend him money. They support him. And when the Jews in Amsterdam receive letters from their cousins in Brazil, they've been kicked out by the Portuguese. The Jews in Amsterdam simply whisper in Oliver Cromwell's ear, we need a place for these people to go. They can go to another Dutch colony if you want them to. The Jews in Brazil, they can go to Suriname, they can go to Curacao. They can grow their sugar in a Dutch colony. They can ship their sugar in Dutch ships. But if you want some of this mercantile activity for the British Empire, you should consider letting them into Barbados. And that's what happened. Oliver Cromwell, by stroke of pen, he made his own unilateral decision. He's going to allow the Jews into Barbados. So this is how the Jews came here. They set up shop in 1654. They started to pray in a building. It did not look like this one, but it was in this location. It was similar to this. And they jump-started the sugar economy in Barbados. Barbados became very well known and very wealthy as a sugar colony. This next document this is a really fascinating. Actually, I don't get to show this document to people that do the in-person tour. I only can do this for people that see this virtually. This is fascinating. So I mentioned the pass of safe passage, the letter of safe passage that Oliver Cromwell had given to Abraham de Mercado. The physical pass itself was lost. But this is a book. This is an image of a book. This is page 135. You can see up at the top, page 135. This book is located in the British Archive at Kew, outside of London. And this is a book that lists all the letters of safe passage that were ever issued during the administration of Oliver Cromwell. They were big on administrative procedure back in the time. So I'm blowing this. Let me go back once. Sorry. So you can see this is just a list. The person's name is in the left-hand column, and then the letter of safe passage, the authorization, is summarized in this right-hand column. So here you have the letter for Abraham de Mercado, and I'm going to bring us to the blown-up passage. And now it has some really interesting components. So it's very clear, Abraham de Mercado. I'm going to translate this into modern English. This is his will, Oliver Cromwell's will, He asked you to permit and suffer Abraham de Mercado, doctor of medicine, of a certain location. This is a place. I haven't been able to make out where he was coming from. Now, look at this. Somebody has inserted in different ink. Somebody has inserted a caret here. And they've added to this entry, a Hebrew by nation. So this is to permit and suffer Abraham de Mercado, doctor of medicine, a Hebrew by nation, with David Raphael de Mercado, his son, to transport themselves to the island of Barbados without any hindrance or molestation, they carrying with them nothing prejudicial to the state. So this record was created on April 27th, 1655. It's signed by Henry Lawrence. Henry Lawrence was the president of Oliver Cromwell's Council of State. It's an administrative body. I'm an amateur historian. To my way of thinking, this is the very first written record of Jews being allowed back into England since the Edict of Expulsion in 1290. If there's anybody here in the audience who has any other information different than this, I would love to hear from you. But this appears to be the first legal admittance of Jews into the British domains after the Edict of Expulsion. This is another image from the museum. Hopefully you'll be able to visit us in Barbados. This is a painting done in 1688. And ostensibly, this is the synagogue building. This is the only image depiction of the old synagogue building taken from Bridgetown Harbor. These are the ships, and this would be the old synagogue building. It's the only image that we have. So now I'm going to go back. 1654, the Jews arrived, they settled, they're doing well in the sugar business. 1739, there's now a second synagogue in Barbados, in Speightstown. This is a little urban area north of Bridgetown. There's a second synagogue called Tzemach David. And they have a wedding at the synagogue in Speightstown, but after the wedding, they invite non-Jews to the party. And this is Barbados. And the rum flows and people get drunk, and this turns into a pogrom. Somebody accuses somebody of something, and the synagogue in Speightstown is burned to the ground, and the Jews are chased out of town by torchlight, and that's the end of the synagogue in Speightstown. It's the only pogrom in Barbados. It's the only really organized anti-Semitic incident in Barbados history. That's in 1739. Go to 1750. This is the height of the Sephardic community here. There are now 800 Jews out of they've taken a census in 1750. There are 12,000 whites, 800 of them are Jews. So Jews are about 4% of the population. This is a big deal. But now you have about 85,000 African slaves in Barbados. These are the ones that are hacking the sugarcane in August. Jews are suffering all kinds of disabilities in Barbados. They're not completely free. Jews are not in the plantation business in Barbados. They can't own land. They're restricted from owning more than 3 acres of land. Jews cannot own more than 3 slaves, so they can't be in the plantation business. But Jews are making their money at the back end of the whole sugar growing cycle. They're involved in the harvest. So here's how the Jews are involved in sugar in Barbados. They set up Dutch windmills at each of the plantations, and they run these Dutch windmills during harvest time 24 hours a day. They're crushing sugar cane and processing the sugar into crystallized sugar at each plantation. Everywhere else in the Caribbean where they grow sugar, they don't have Dutch windmills. You might have seen this in the movies. They take wagon wheels and mount them on vertical axes, and they get cattle and slaves to push these wheels to crush the sugar cane. So in Barbados, they're not producing more sugar than everywhere else. They're just producing it more efficiently than everywhere else by a factor of 3 or something like that. Some Jewish people in Barbados are becoming incredibly wealthy. There's a man here buried in the cemetery. Hopefully we'll have time to visit him. Let me check my time. It's 11:38. We have about 20 minutes left. There's a man buried in Barbados, David Raphael de Mercado. This is actually the son of the man who was carrying the pass from Oliver Cromwell. David Raphael de Mercado invented the device that you put in a Dutch windmill that converts it into a sugar factory. And he and his descendants were making money from all the windmills operating in Barbados and later throughout the Caribbean. This was one of the wealthiest men in the Western Hemisphere in the 17th century. It's important to remember that sugar production in the 17th century is the equivalent of what petroleum is today. So today you have all these oil tankers roaming around the globe distributing the petroleum. Back then in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, it wasn't oil, it was spice and primarily sugar. And the Jews in Barbados were at the very heart of this sugar trade. In Barbados and throughout the Caribbean, in the 1750, you can buy things with sugar. 5 pounds of sugar will buy you this, 10 pounds of sugar will buy you that. It's a currency. So now I'm showing you, this is an image of a newspaper article from 1834. So I left you in 1750. By 1820, the sugar industry has fallen apart. This is because you can now get sugar from beets. This is like sugar from potatoes that grow underground in Europe. And in Barbados, cane sugar is harvested by slaves. In 1834, the British Empire outlaws slavery altogether. So if you're in the sugar business and the cane sugar business, the equation changed. You can't really make money. Starting in the 1820s, you can't make money in cane sugar anymore. So in the 1820s, Barbados starts to empty out. Economically, it becomes very depressed. A lot of the Jews leave. And August 31st of 1831, a hurricane visits Barbados and finishes it off. So 800 structures come down, 20% of the population dies. Everybody assumes after the hurricane of 1831 that Barbados is just going to wither away. But in 1834, you're down to about 50 Jewish families in Barbados. 2 of these families in particular have money, and they decide they want to make a statement. So in 1834, the Jewish community in Barbados rebuilds the synagogue. They hire 2 British architects, and they spend £5,000. This is almost $1 million in today's money. And they rebuild the synagogue in 1834. The article that you see here, which you would, obviously you can't read it, it's too small, but when you get to visit us in person, you'll be able to see that this is an article describing the rededication of the synagogue in 1834. This was an island-wide event. It was a party. Everybody was invited. And by 1834, the Jews in Barbados have full civil equality. They're participating in government. They lead philanthropic organizations. And they're part and parcel of regular society in Barbados. They're intermarrying furiously. This is an image of the synagogue that was taken in the 1890s. So by now you're down to about a dozen Jews, and there's no regular service, but they still have these, they still have all the regalia, all the silver ceremonial objects and everything else. In 1922, there are 2 Jews left in Barbados. This is Edmund and Joseph Baeza. These are retail merchants on Swan Street. We have Edmund Baeza's diary in the Barbados Museum. So Edmund writes in his diary, he comes to the synagogue every Saturday morning and he opens it for services. He knows nobody's coming, but this is his job and he does it. He does this until he dies. Then his brother sells the building to a law firm. The building became a law library in 1931. By 1945, this was an office building in the British colonial administration. There were cryptographers decoding German radio messages sitting on the 2nd floor. It's really, if you remember the images of the sanctuary, it's really hard to imagine, but the building had been converted into an office building. There were internal staircases, and you can see there are aluminum windows, and it looked nothing like a synagogue. Here's another image of it. This is when it was in 1985. This was the synagogue was an office building, or actually a warehouse that was owned by the government of Barbados. And they had a plan to tear it down in 1985. This is prime real estate in downtown Bridgetown. They were going to put the Supreme Court of Barbados in this space. But in 1985 now you have 100 Ashkenazi Jews in Barbados. This is a different group of Jews entirely. The Sephardi Jews have left. In the 1930s, there were a few Jewish families who arrived in Barbados. We all know from our modern European history how this worked. If you were a Jew in 1930s and somebody would let you in, that was good enough. That's where you went. So in the 1930s, somehow several families found their way into Barbados. And in 1985, the grandchildren of these Ashkenazi Jews raised their hands. This is now my opinion. I think these people deserve credit. The Ashkenazi Jews here raised their hands and they said to the government of Barbados, "You should not be tearing this building down." They didn't own this building. They had no interest in it. They were using the cemetery, but they knew what the history of the building had been, and they just thought it was just a bad idea. So in 1985, two members of the Jewish community here in Barbados, these are still members of our community, they went to the Barbados Museum and they got photographs of the old synagogue, like the one I had just showed you, and with the rabbis and their beards and the Torah scrolls. And they take these photographs to Prime Minister Tom Adams in 1985, and they're effective with their presentation. They convinced the government to cede this property to the Barbados National Trust, as I described. And the Jewish community, these Ashkenazi Jews, commit to raise $1.5 million to restore the building. This is the beginning of the construction, to restore the building as a working synagogue and as a museum and as a tourist attraction for the island. Pardon me for 1 second. So this is how it came out. Looks pretty good. This is another image from the outside. This is an interior image. Everything here is a restoration that's based on the plans that they still have, the architect's plans from 1834. So they were able to recreate everything. You'll notice the lights are electrified. Obviously in 1834, they would have had candle-powered chandeliers, but they've electrified them just for convenience sake. This is another view of the sanctuary in different lighting. There are two items that I'd like to point out that are original from 1834. One is the Aseret HaDibrot that you see here, and the clock. The clock had been preserved in the Barbados Museum, and the Ten Commandments had been actually located. Let me go back to them. There we go. The Ten Commandments, these two tablets in 1985 were found hanging over the swimming pool of the Governor General's house in Barbados. Nobody has any idea why they were there, but that's where they were. And they were brought back. So this is original and the clock is original, but otherwise the clock and the Aseret HaDibrot. Otherwise, everything is a restoration. Let me check our time. We have about 15 minutes. We're good. So now I'm going to give you a quick survey of the cemeteries. This is another short video. Notice these stones are flat against the ground. So up until 1945, this area of the cemetery was actually a car park, and this had been paved over with asphalt. So what you see now is a restoration with stones that had been scattered elsewhere in the compound. They were brought back based on a map that we have. But up until 1945, this was all covered with asphalt, and this was all part of a car park. Here you get a better view. Here you can see how the stones are raised up above the ground on these pedestals. That's the way they were originally installed. Here's another section of the cemetery. Notice the very small tombstones. These are for children. The two oldest tombstones in the cemetery here are this one, 1662, and this one from 1665. Here you'll see upright tombstones. These are Ashkenazi Jews that have found spaces in the old Sephardic synagogue, and they've put in their own tombs here. Any tomb with a vertical is an Ashkenazi tomb. The ones that are horizontal are the Sephardi tombs. We have a new space. You can see it behind this tree, barely visible, with 60 new spaces here. We've determined that these are all going to be flat stones. We're not going to do uprights anymore. In order to be buried in the cemetery here, you need to be a member of the Jewish community in good standing for 10 years. I'm just going to point out briefly this triangular tombstone. This is a little bit different. It's hard to see how different this is. There we go. That's a better view of it. This is David Raphael de Mercado. This is the Jeff Bezos character from the 17th century. This is the guy that invented the sugar factory that works in a windmill. In addition to being an inventor, he was also an artist and a physician like his father. He designed this tombstone himself. It's hard to see. It has all these flowers, very intricate design. He sent this design to a craftsman in Venice, Italy. This is carved out of Croatian marble by a Venetian craftsman, and it sat in the workshop there for 15 years awaiting the man's death. When he died, they carved the date on it and shipped it to Barbados. This was a small fortune for this tombstone. And if you look at it in comparison to all the other flat ones, it really is sort of like a neon sign. It really sticks out. This is a guy who's saying, I have a lot of money and do something about it. So this is another tombstone. I'm going to spend a minute on this guy. Let me see what our time is. We have 9 minutes. This is a really fascinating man. In my ranking, he's our most famous resident here. So it's hard to see. This is Raphael Chaim Isaac Carrigal. You can see the last name quite clearly. This is his tombstone. Not much to the tombstone, but this is his picture, much more to the picture. So this is Raphael Chaim Isaac Carrigal. He died here on May 5th, 1777. He was the rabbi in Barbados. This portrait of his is hanging at Yale University. I always wanted my portrait hung at Yale. I never had the $5 million you need to get your portrait hung at Yale. So I like to tell how this man gets his portrait hung at Yale. So this is a rabbi. He was born in Hebron, in Ottoman Palestine, in 1733. We have a lot of information about this man. He was trained in Hebron as a rabbi, and after he was done with his training, they thought he was well-spoken and presented well. They sent him out from Ottoman Palestine as a shaliach. This is a job title in the 18th century. Man's job is to go out to the broad Jewish community and raise money for the destitute Jews of Palestine. So this is his job, and he does this incredibly well. You can't really tell from here, but this is a very tall man. He's 6'2". For the time, this is a giant man. He can preach in 6 languages. This man is completely, totally fluent in 6 languages, and he's conversant in half a dozen others. They keep sending him out from Palestine to raise money. He's very good at this job. He comes back with more and more money. This becomes the most traveled rabbi in history up until the invention of railroads. This man is all over the planet on sailing ships. He's as far east as Isfahan which in the 18th century is the capital of Persia. In the he's as far west as Curacao, which is a Dutch island that's 300 miles west of Barbados. This man spent a decade in Northern Europe. He was the highest paid rabbi in London for 2 years. He's been all over the world. In 1773, on the holiday of Purim, in 1773, this man appears in colonial North America at the Truro Synagogue. Those of you from North America know the Truro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, is the oldest synagogue structure in North America. So this man, Raphael Chaim Isaac Carregal, is preaching in Spanish from this pulpit on Purim in 1773. Pardon me. In the audience is a non-Jewish man. His name is Ezra Stiles. This is Ezra Stiles. Ezra Stiles is a minister. He's a Protestant minister, and he's listening with fascination to Carregal's sermon. Stiles is minister of a Protestant flock that follows the Old Testament, not the New Testament. So he's interested in Carregal because Carregal speaks Hebrew. This is the only man he's ever met that knows Hebrew, and Hebrew is the key to the Old Testament. So this man Stiles approaches Carregal after the sermon, and this is before the age of interfaith dialogue. Remember, this is 1773. But Carregal is a man of the world, and he agrees to teach Ezra Stiles Hebrew. So these two men become good friends. He teaches him Hebrew, and they start to exchange letters that they write in Hebrew where they talk about their personal lives and the events of the day. They do this just as a way of practicing their Hebrew. This is before the age of modern spoken Hebrew in Israel today. So these letters exist today. They're in the Yale Library. They're written in a very Siddur-like archaic Hebrew, but they become invaluable historical documents because of what they describe. So anyhow, at the end of that year, 1773, this man that you're looking at now, this is Ezra Stiles, he's appointed as the president of Yale College. This is where it all starts at Yale. His friend Carregal is appointed the rabbi in Barbados. So Carregal goes to Barbados. Ezra Stiles goes to Yale. Stiles' first act as the president of Yale in 1773 is he makes Hebrew language a required course for every student entering Yale. This is actually not a very popular thing to be doing in 1773, and especially considering there's only one person at Yale who knows how to teach Hebrew, and that's Ezra Stiles. This is the beginning of a period in Yale history called the Hebrew Revolution at Yale. It's written about in great detail. Anyhow, so this man is the president of Yale throughout the American Revolution. Get your time frame in mind. The American Revolution is happening now. In 1776, in 1781, this man, Ezra Stiles, makes his first speech to the Yale community after the end of the Revolutionary War. This is in New Haven. He goes out onto the quad in New Haven. He's speaking to everybody in public, and he talks to them in Hebrew for half an hour. Nobody has any idea what's going on, and then he switches to Aramaic. In 1783 and in 1785, the valedictorians of Yale College deliver their valedictory addresses in Hebrew. Pardon me.
Neal, it's so hard to give you a timestamp, but we have 3 minutes left, and I definitely want to make sure that people have the opportunity to learn more about how they can join you in Barbados.
Okay, I'm almost there.
Okay.
So, anyhow, Ezra Stiles in his will asked that his portrait hang with his friend Carregal's portrait in the Yale Library. And these two portraits hang together for 127 years. In 1933, Stiles' family, they regained control of this portrait. This is a priceless artwork. Both of these portraits are painted by Samuel King. in the 1740s. Samuel King is a famous portrait artist. He's painted 3 portraits of George Washington. Anyhow, Ezra Stiles' portrait was taken away by his family. Carrigal is still hanging in the main foyer of the Sterling Library at Yale, and he's buried right in our cemetery here. This is the mikveh in Barbados. This was discovered by accident in 2007. They were digging up the asphalt in the parking lot, and they discovered the mikveh. This is natural spring water that was here in 1650, and they rediscovered it, and it's quite a sight. This is I'm just going to give you some closing photos here. This is a nice evening photo of the event of a service we had. This is my favorite photo. This photo gets credit. This photo was taken by Renee Salomon. Renee is the wife of Rabbi Thomas Salomon from London, who was the winter rabbi here for 2 years. But Renee Salomon on her own is a world-class photographer and artist. She took this image on Erev Purim in 2020. And this is our courtyard in the moonlight in Barbados. This is Renee Salomon. Those of you that are interested in the facts and the details, there's a tremendous amount that's been written about the Jews of Barbados. There's a native of Barbados, a man named Simon Kreinler. I think I saw him on this call. He grew up in Barbados, and he's written 2 books, one about the Ashkenazi Jews, Peddlers All, and another one about the Sephardi Jews of Barbados. This book just came out. They're both available wherever books are sold. I highly recommend them. This is, I mentioned this, we have a little steeple. This is where we're going to have our Rosh Hashanah services. This is an air-conditioned place in Christchurch, Barbados. And this is peddlers in transition. These are the Ashkenazi Jews who got out of the peddling business, and now they're in commercial services, professional services. They're doctors and lawyers. This is our website. This is an advertisement. We do bar mitzvahs and weddings in Barbados. Destination bar mitzvahs and weddings. You can learn all about our community here. This is a conservative congregation. You can learn all about our community at jewishbarbados.org. Just so you know, if you put in .com, it's going to take you to Chabad of Barbados. But if you want to see our community, it's jewishbarbados.org. And we invite you to make donations, especially to our cemetery fund. We have a major project underway to restore the Sephardic tombstones that really need help. Anybody who's watching this presentation who's in a position to give $18 or any amount, we would welcome you to visit our website. And on the donate button, there's an area for cemeteries. If you're interested in me and my books, I'm an author. I have my own website, nealrechtman.com. And I'm happy now to entertain questions.
Thank you so much, Neal. And we will make sure to share both the synagogue's information as well as your website in our follow-up. We are sadly out of time today, but we are getting lots of positive feedback in the chat, which I'm going to be happy to share with you. And just so everyone knows, we will share a recording of this entire presentation. So if you missed anything, fear not. You can watch the recording later. This was a lovely tour, and I do want to thank you, Neal, for everything, and thank you all.
I hope everybody will come visit us. Please visit us.
We have people who have booked tickets already, so
okay.
You'll be seeing people soon. All right, thank you all.
Make sure you're in touch. Make sure you're in touch beforehand so we can show you around.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Bye bye, everyone.
Bye bye.